GreenSense show is sponsored by CEA Technology, providing a sustainable modular indoor growing system. Visit CEATechn.com to learn more. Is there a silent clean energy manufacturing boom happening in the US? I'm Robert Colangelo, and this is GreenSense, where we bring you eco-innovations that are changing your world. Dan McCarthy is news editor at Canary Media. He wrote an article about the 6 key takeaways about the U.S. clean energy manufacturing boom that will surprise you. He joins us now to discuss the article. Dan, welcome to GreenSense.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start out with Canary Media. It's an independent nonprofit newsroom covering the transition to clean energy and solutions to the climate crisis. Tell us more.
Yeah, sure. So, you kind of nailed the mission statement there, but Canary Media is a relatively new outlet. We formed in April 2021. And although it's a new outlet, it is the product of a bunch of clean energy journalists who have been covering the space for a really long time. Many of them were at Green Media before, which any listeners who are very immersed in the clean energy space will likely be familiar with. And when the publication shut down, Green Media, they kind of banded together to form a new one, and Canary Media is the result of that. We are a relatively small team, about 16 of us now, and as you said, we're covering the transition to clean energy, and it's a relatively poorly understood topic, we think, and we're trying to do our best to change that.
Did you know Michael Canellis?
No, I did not.
I think he worked at Green Tech. He had been on the show a number of times. Great guy. Yeah. I saw him on 60 Minutes. He covered the one of the first fuel cells, and so we saw him on 60 Minutes, and then he was a reoccurring guest on the show. But you guys did great work there. So let's get into maybe one of your favorite topics. You're the news editor at Canary Media. How'd you get interested in covering clean energy?
Yeah. And to be clear, I'm actually one of the newer people at Canary Media. I didn't come from the Green Tech squad. That was, the people who founded it. And I joined more recently from a publication called Morning Brew, which is a business news publication. And I was the tech editor there. And in that time, I was able to cover clean energy and climate tech as kind of part of this really big umbrella of technology, which can kind of mean whatever you want it to mean. And in covering clean energy through that, I just really came to love the topic. I mean, it's really easy to feel like nothing is happening about climate change and nothing is happening with respect to an energy transition if you don't seek out information about it. And the closer I got to the topic, the more inspired I felt, and the more interested I felt, and dare I say, the more hopeful I felt, about sort of the energy transition and all of that. So that's how I wound up covering clean energy, and I got lucky enough to get into Canary Media in my current role as news editor, and here I am.
Well, with the Inflation Reduction Act, this is a good time to be in clean energy and all that's happening technologically. So let's get into the 6 points into your article.
Sure.
The first one is clean energy manufacturing is no longer a niche. It's at the forefront in the U.S. economy. So what verticals make up clean energy manufacturing?
Sure.
Give us a broad stroke of what does that include?
Yeah, well, the big ones are manufacturing solar panels, manufacturing lithium-ion batteries that both go into electric vehicles, and also stationary storage batteries that can be used to store solar that is, over-generated during the day when it's sunny out, so that it can be dispatched at night when there's no sun, or same thing with wind when the wind is blowing. And then, of course, there's wind manufacturing, so creating turbines and blades and things like that, as well as I mentioned EVs, but assembling electric vehicles. You could count more nascent technologies like hydrogen electrolyzers, things like that. But the core ones are what I just mentioned: solar, wind, EVs, batteries.
We like to be fact-based on the show. So, what data do you have to support that the U.S. is in the forefront of manufacturing clean energy technology?
Yeah, the big number right now that we've been kind of talking about in our coverage is that in the last 10 months or so since the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, just between last August and this is through the end of May, about $75 billion in clean energy manufacturing investment has been announced. And that's both new projects and some factory expansions, of existing facilities. But it's about 100 different projects, a little bit less than that make up that number. And again, it's in less than a year that all of this investment has kind of opened up. And it's part of this bigger factory boom in the US that's kind of under discussed right now. Manufacturing spending, I think, has just about doubled between this year and last year. It's largely due to the Inflation Reduction Act, but also the CHIPS and Science Act, which put about $50 billion into semiconductor manufacturing in the US. And manufacturing as a whole in the US is kind of surging back to life a bit. And I think there's a good case to be made that clean energy is a big part of that. I'll leave you with one last number on it, which is that some analysis by Blue Green Alliance says that in the next 10 years, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, every year there will be 1 million new jobs created in clean energy manufacturing. For context, there's about 13 million people who work in manufacturing in the US total right now. And that's 1 million created every year.
Almost 10%.
Yeah, and it's a forecast, right? So grain of salt, but even if they're off by half, it's still significant, right? So I think there's a great case to be made for it being right front and center.
So the $64,000 question, with rising interest rates and talk about the economy being on the brink of recession, why don't we hear much about this in the mainstream industry? Why is this the best kept secret that there's a boom here?
It's hard to say, and we're doing our best to change it at Canary.
There's only 16 of you.
That's right. There's only 16 of us, and that's including the business side. So we're a small group. But I think part of it is that clean energy can feel a bit abstract to people who aren't close up to it. Not everyone has, probably not, the majority of people haven't been super close to an electric vehicle, a solar panel. They don't have the hands-on experience with it. I think the energy system and utilities are also just generally kind of an abstract concept, and that's where a lot of this stuff kind of resides. It's hard, I don't quite have a clear answer on it, but it's definitely a problem. And
you would think the Biden administration would want to take all sorts of credit for this. You never hear much about this at all. Matter of fact, the Inflation Reduction Act has been out for a while, but I didn't even know if it was being administered.
Well, it's a good point, and that I think it's something like 2/3 of Americans have heard of the Inflation Reduction Act, just at least heard the title, but only 20% of them know that there's anything in there that would have a benefit to them. And that was from a survey done earlier this year. So, and that's despite the fact that there's all these tax credits inside of the Inflation Reduction Act that cover everything from getting new windows on your house that are more energy efficient to, helping you offset the cost of upgrading your electrical panel, to bigger things like putting solar on your roof. But the point being, people don't even know about the stuff that can directly benefit them as an individual homeowner or just general person out there living their life. They certainly don't know about the manufacturing boom, because that's just it's just another layer of abstraction on top of it, and it's a problem. There definitely is some mainstream coverage. New York Times did a piece, coincidentally, I think a week before we published a bunch of our coverage on this topic, that had the same essential thesis of climate loss spurring a bunch of investment in clean energy. But I don't know, we're not the first to observe it, but it certainly has not really broken through to the general.
Hopefully will help bring awareness to more. Let's get into point 2. Clean energy manufacturing is surging in the US, but the country is far from self-sufficient. What needs to be done to make the US self-sufficient, and do we want to be self-sufficient?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. I mean, if you ask Joe Manchin, who, for listeners who don't know, was the deciding vote in the Inflation Reduction Act, it would not have passed without him, and it didn't seem like it was going to pass for a while because of him, but it did. And if you ask him why he voted, he's going to tell you, 100% of the reason was energy security, and he wants us to be able to get to a place that we're producing we're in control of our energy destiny, basically. So some people think it's very important, some people think it's less important, right? There's kind of the two schools of thought on it. But what will it mean for us to be self-sufficient? It kind of depends on how you define it, right? You know, if you mean 100% self-sufficient, the US will have a lot more mines. The US will have a lot more refineries and processing plants. The US will have a lot more factories, which, you know, as we've said, we're getting those. And that's a really simplified picture, right? But the point is, it's not just factories, right? You need to mine the minerals, like for instance, for batteries and EVs, you need to mine the minerals that go into the battery, you need to refine those minerals, then you need to assemble them, and you assemble them into all these different parts that then need to be assembled into the bigger part, and then it might go into a car that also needs to be assembled, right? So there's all these steps in the supply chain, and it's a really wickedly complex thing to try and become completely self-sufficient, and probably not totally possible, because we simply like don't have the mineral reserves for some of the stuff that we need in the US alone. Recycling would help offset some of that, and there's efforts at battery recycling that are really promising, but you know, realistically, the US is not going to be 100% self-sufficient on clean energy, but it can control more of its destiny, and onshoring manufacturing is a big step toward that.
Especially when geopolitics starts shifting from oil to different minerals and components of these clean energy things. Those are the ones that we want to control. Let's
Yeah.
move on to the next one. The Inflation Reduction Act is reversing the year-long slowdown in U.S. wind manufacturing. Dan, we could spend an entire show on the IRA and would be happy to have you back to discuss just that in detail. It's complex, and as you said, there's a lot into it. But let's drill down into your point. How has the IRA specifically assisted wind manufacturing, and what kind of companies are the beneficiaries?
Yeah, so I mean the short answer here is tax credits, right? So there was a tax credit that's been around for some time. I'm not sure exactly when it went into effect, but basically it helped make producing the parts necessary for wind turbine, or for offshore wind onshore wind economic in the US. And those tax credits had lapsed before, because the government just kind of let it lapse. And there was uncertainty about whether that was going to lapse again. And the industry really likes certainty, right? They want to know that their cost is going to be X in a certain year, and it's not going to change. And when they had this uncertainty around these tax credits that subsidized the cost of producing some of the parts needed for wind, you know, they get scared. And that led a couple wind manufacturers like Siemens, another one from Vestas, which have had suspended operations in the US, because they were like, you know, we just don't know if the numbers are gonna work out if this tax credit doesn't come through. Inflation Reduction Act locked that tax credit in for a decade, and gave the industry that certainty back, essentially. And they don't have to do the wavering that they did before with the sort of, is it going to be there, is it going to not? They know it's there for a decade. They can make investments based on that. And in fact, the companies I mentioned before, so Siemens reopened, I believe, 2 wind manufacturing plants after the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. And CS Wind, which is a Chinese firm, started expanding a wind manufacturing facility, turbine manufacturing facility in Colorado that it had bought from Vestas, and it's planning to become the world's largest plant for wind towers by 2028. So this sort of thing was on pause before the Inflation Reduction Act, and is now kind of picking up steam again because of that certainty.
Are IRA funds evenly distributed among the states, or are you seeing certain winners either because of size or politics? What comes to mind is California. You know, they've set some pretty high bars there on what they want to do for greenhouse gas reductions. Are they getting a disproportional amount, or are there other states that are getting more?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost the complete opposite of what you would expect. So it's not an even distribution, and it's disproportionate in favor of generally red states in the Southeast. So Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, and North Carolina are some of the leading states. Georgia and South Carolina are really the 2 big ones, and Georgia by a bigger shot. I think the number that we had was about 17 billion is, how much of that manufacturing investment they've received since the IRA, which is by far the most of any state. And it's interesting, right? It does kind of, it's not the kind of clean energy crusaders that are getting most of the money. It's really these southeastern states that have, environments that are perhaps a bit more business friendly, which can be a bit of a euphemism for, there's a little bit less labor power. The unions are weaker down there, especially with respect to EV manufacturing, and a lot of the investment that those states are getting is in electric vehicle and battery manufacturing for electric vehicles. It's really kind of a new automotive hotspot, and it just happens to be, electrified. And yeah, I mean, these states also have really aggressively pursued some of these funds. Georgia has a person in their government who is dedicated to sort of drumming up business from South Korean firms. South Korea is home to some of the largest battery makers in the world. There aren't that many companies that can make batteries at a large scale, and South Korea has 2 of them. And there's a person in Georgia's government who literally has kind of courted those companies to come and invest in the state, and they won.
Well, plus, you have big utilities down there with big lobbying efforts like Duke Energy and Georgia Power. So you've actually answered the 4th point. The southeastern United States is emerging as a key hub for clean energy and manufacturing. And these are some of the reasons why. And it is counterintuitive, because the South is predominantly a Republican-based area, and Dems have been pretty much supportive of these renewable energy programs. So has that flourished because of local policies, or more just good, aggressive business?
Yeah, I mean, I think the understanding that we have, and this is from some reporting that Julian Spector, who's a senior reporter at Canary Media, did for on this topic, is they have a friendly business environment. Like I said, they've got kind of lower taxes, a little bit less labor power. They're putting together these huge incentive programs. They're really going out there and selling their state as a good place to do business. And companies liked what they saw. In the case of Georgia too, there's an interesting thing. They've got a workforce training program called Quick Start. It's been around since like the 60s. And essentially it's just, hey company, we will make sure that you don't have totally green employees if you come here. We'll do a little bit of the training for you. We'll, give you people who are.
Yeah, I didn't know what you meant by green. Green could be taken by the way.
Yeah, good point. Good point. As in new to the field.
Young, right. Unexperienced, not environmentally motivated.
Yes. That's true. I should be more precise in this context. But they essentially just do a little bit of the work to train the companies, and some of the firms that have gone there have cited that as a reason as well. So.
Well, your 5th point was about tax credits. And so what makes tax credits Byzantine, and why are they working for the clean energy industry?
I mean, they're just really, really complex to administer. It's not as cut and dried as every electric vehicle gets, 30% off, and you see that in your tax returns. These are, it's weird. Our climate law is being administered through the tax code, basically, right? So we've got these really contentious debates that are happening around every single clean energy tax credit, pretty much, about what exactly ought to qualify, because pretty much every tax credit eligibility is predicated on some amount of made in America, some threshold of made in America, right? So for EVs, for instance, in order for the electric vehicle to qualify for the tax credit, it needs to have some portion of its battery components assembled in the USA. It needs to have some portion of the minerals that come from the USA or free trade partners. So there are these stipulations that are just really debated, because it goes down, it gets as granular as like, okay, 40% of the battery materials by 2026. 50% by 2027, right? So there's all this granularity that comes with it. And these things are just, that's what the IRS is working to figure out, and the Treasury is working to figure out and releasing kind of guidance on in a slow trickle. And it's just very complicated.
But why are they working?
The reason that they work is that they're subsidies. At the end of the day, they might be complex to administer.
But people figure it out.
Yeah, and they might not apply to every single person. They have some stipulations, but if you meet those stipulations, you get a lot of money back, right? So there's both tax credits for producers that make it cost less to produce clean energy products in the US. And there are also tax credits on the consumer side, like the electric vehicle one. And those incentivize consumers to purchase clean energy products that they may not have been able to afford previously or that weren't cost competitive before. And that has the upstream effect of making it make more economic sense for the producers to make the things. And again, all of those tax credits are contingent to some extent. It varies, it varies a lot, varies year to year, credit to credit, but all of them are contingent to some extent on the thing in question being made in the US.
And you can see why that doesn't make the evening news. Right.
Exactly.
So your last point is none of this is going to succeed if the US doesn't quickly train a qualified workforce. So the question I have is a lot of clean energy is new industry, and there's not a lot of experience. So who's going to train the trainers to train the new workers?
It's a great question. I mean, I mentioned the Georgia Quick Start program before, which is one model that, some states could take. And you can see states playing a role here in saying, if hey, company, we want you to invest in a clean energy manufacturing facility here. We'll take some of the burden of training your employees off of you. That's what Georgia has done. Other states could follow. And that's one route. I mean, companies themselves can also do it, right? Like they are the ones who have the manufacturing expertise in-house. And of course they do train people. And it's going to be one of the primary ways that it happens. But these companies want to move fast also. So to your point, it's important for there to be other actors kind of helping move things along.
What about unions? Historically, they've been good at apprentice programs and training a workforce to do installation. Is this a new way to either reinvent themselves or to create an opportunity to create apprentice programs along clean energy manufacturing?
Sure. I mean, I think I don't see why not. To be clear, I'm no expert in union history, but I don't see why it wouldn't be an opportunity that they could seize. And I think with cars, it's really complex because EVs require they have fewer parts than internal combustion vehicles, which means less labor is required to manufacture them. And this is an issue that Sean Fain, the president of the UAW, has been pretty vocal about. This is a problem and we got to make sure people don't get left behind. And so there's some complications with some of it, right? Where, that's still being negotiated, especially on the automotive front. But for unions like that, IBEW, electrical workers, sure. I mean, like we need a lot more electricians. That's not manufacturing exactly, but
right.
In order to put the stuff into practice after it's been made, we need so many more electricians. So
that's what I would think. The electric union could really be licking their chops here.
Yeah, I mean that one feels straightforward, and it's well known that we need a lot more. At least, we need a lot more electricians. And then we did a piece as well on kind of coal, on the mining workers union and some of their efforts to train displaced coal workers into clean energy jobs. It's really early on. They've started a couple programs with it, and they're talking to some battery manufacturers about like, hey, we've got smart, hardworking, skilled people who don't have jobs at the moment or are underemployed. Maybe we could figure something out here. And there's a company called Sparks that's working with them in West Virginia, but the plant I'm not sure if the plant has even broken ground yet. Maybe it has broken ground, but it's not up and running. So it's early. It's early still.
Dan, any closing remarks?
I mean, I think we've covered a lot of ground here, but I'll just reiterate what I kind of opened up with, which is that it's only been 10 months since the Inflation Reduction Act passed. And, we're sitting here talking about, figures that are approaching $100 billion in investment, more than 100 or nearly 100 factory announcements that have been made. and it's less than a year since the bill was passed. All of the tax credits I talked about, all the subsidies I talked about, they're locked in for a decade. So there's a lot more to come, I would expect. I can't tell the future, but I would expect the incentives are there for there to be a lot more investment, and excited to see where it'll go.
Well, Dan, that was an informative and enjoyable conversation. Thank you for joining us on the GreenSense Show.
Thank you.
That's Dan McCarthy, news editor at Canary Media, who wrote about America's best kept secret, the U.S. clean energy manufacturing boom. Visit the GreenSenseShow.com website to learn more about sponsorship. I'm Robert Colangelo. Thank you for listening to GreenSense, and check out the GreenSense Minute every Thursday and Saturday on 105.9 FM, WBBM Chicago. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks. That was fun.